Our society needs to address complex problems that require huge amounts of cooperation. Yet, I can't even convince my neighbor upstairs to be considerate of the people living below him. How are we not doomed as a species? I will try to illustrate my current feeling of complete powerlessness in a geographical layer model. Layer 1. I live in a multi-storage house in the first floor. We rent, the neighbor above me owns his flat, and when he bought it, kicked out a family that lived there before. He is the most obnoxious prick I ever had as a neighbor. Doesn't greet you, moves around like a trampling elephant, has parties during workdays. Layer 2. I live in a city street where parking is a huge problem because European cities weren't built for each family to own 2 SUVs. Cars park on the pavement, blocking ramps for wheelchair users, for example, and taking away space from pedestrians. Layer 3. I live in a district where we have a problem with street racing. Rich kids undertake races with their expensive cars through the city. Last year someone died in a car crash caused by one of these races. The rich kids also park their cars where they please because the fine for them is just pocket change. Layer 4. I live in a city where rents increased by 100%, at least, in the last decade. There is not enough room for ordinary people or families anymore. Rich people are buying houses as assets, the city is in huge debts and tries to stop the tide of incoming investors but is ultimately powerless. The infrastructure is collapsing under extreme increase of new residents over the last 10 years. Layer 5. I live in a part of a country that used to be very poor. Industry moved away 20 to 30 years ago, blue-collar workers are pissed and start voting for the right-wing populists. The comparatively small influx of migrants is blamed for everything, even though it is pretty obvious that they didn't make the decision to move away blue-collar jobs in the 1990s, nor is the affordable housing connected to them. Layer 6. I live in a country so scared of the blue-collar workers voting for the right-wing populists that we forget to tackle problems like education, housing, infrastructure, social equality, unemployment, pensions, healthcare, all of which are problems that will only make the situation worse for people who don't have money to begin with right now and will further threaten the social peace. Layer 7. I live on a continent that was ravaged by wars some 70 to 100 years ago. That built up a diplomatic and economic system with a strict moral compass that tries to prevent this while also guaranteeing prosperity for all. That system has eroded or might even collapse in the near future. Layer 8. I live on a part of the planet that thought 1989 marked the end of history, but woke up to a new millennium that clearly showed this wasn't the case. Layer 9. I live on a planet suffering from climate change, extreme pollution, gigantic problems that would need a huge amount of global cooperation, yet I can't even convince my neighbor upstairs to be considerate of the people living below him or convince people in my street that buying an SUV in a city is a stupid idea. You want optimism out of nihilism? Our greed is a stronger vice than our stupidity. As a social animal, our survival goals really do require cooperation. Selfishness is a luxury we can only afford when things are good. When things get bad enough, we end up cooperating because we like being alive more than we like being fractious douchebags. We tend to think in absolutes when really life is far more of a spectrum, and contrary to what mass media would have you believe, very, very few humans are on the extremes of any one of those spectrums. Most of us are in the middle, capable both of good and evil at any given moment in any given context. What you are describing is just run-of-the-mill self-centeredness that everyone is guilty of subjecting others to at some point or another, sometimes with good reason but usually without. If you are driving your father who is having a heart attack to the hospital and cut some people off on the highway to get him there faster, that's a justifiable self-centered action in my view. If you are just impatient on your way to work, that's an issue. When it really matters, people usually surprise you with how benevolent they are as their default modus operandi when the context of the situation shifts from everyday life to some sort of crisis which necessitates putting our selfish desires aside and letting someone cut you off in traffic so they can get their dying father to the hospital faster. It takes a lot of conditioning/training for people's initial reaction to be hostile and/or violent in crises. More often than not, if left to its own devices with no willpower to act upon a given situation, life/universe/God opts for a new and diverse experience. We usually interpret this change as a negative consequence of life and tend to take it a bit personally, but I think that's just a limit of our trying to impose our own sense of morality on a larger system without the proper context in place to understand what's going on. Much like the driver who was cut off by you on the highway who never actually found out why you cut him off and remained mad at you the rest of the day even though you had a pretty good reason to inconvenience that driver for 3 seconds. Consider for a moment that we managed to organize all the world's air traffic with almost no casualties, and that millions of drivers zoom across the country's roads with relatively few accidents. We have complex systems of laws that are largely being followed and enforced. You are typing this on a device built by several companies all over the planet out of shit we dug out of the ground. Someone is ensuring that you get drinking water and electricity every day, and feeding yourself is as simple as going to a store and giving the person pieces of metal. You are currently seeing this because the internet works on agreed-upon protocols, and because of the millions of lines of codes thousands of programmers piece together. All of this works because we coordinate. Sometimes, we can't coordinate well because of conflicting or competing interests, but it's hardly the norm.